In 2009, the U.S. Department of Labor commissioned a systematic literature review on the gender wage gap. This video walks through what that 95-page report concluded and why almost no one has ever heard of it. I've had a copy of this report in my personal reference library for nearly 15 years, and I refer to it on occasion. But I've never really had an opportunity to offer a full lecture-style discussion about it. So I'm glad that so many of you appreciate these data-driven analytical videos that I do. And I hope you enjoy learning from it as much as I enjoyed making it. Coming up, what I'll be discussing is that 95-page report based on 40 years of wage data that reached a clear conclusion about the so-called wage gap. I'll walk through what approximately 50 studies actually showed, how much of the wage gap they explained, and why this information never made it into the public narratives that you hear today. Here's the outline that I'll be working with. Context around that 2009 report, 7 major themes about the research findings, why people still believe the wage gap exists, and why you've never heard about this report and its findings. So listen while you commute to work or you get your steps in, because this will be another somewhat longer topic. And it gives you all of the details you'll ever need to debunk the wage gap when people try to convince you that it's real.
It's time to all choose your timeline on the roller coaster of life.
Before I get started, let me save some of you some time. If your response to this video is, I already know that the wage gap is a myth, then I suggest tuning out now and going about your business. This is not about telling you something you already know. It's about giving you the evidence to support it, rather than just repeating the same talking points. And there's also a reason that I'm not focusing on anything newer than this 2009 report. That's because I want to make it abundantly clear what was studied, confirmed, and acknowledged by the U.S. Department of Labor nearly 20 years ago. Researchers, the government, and research firms have all known all of this for decades. The report that I'm covering today is a review that was commissioned by the Department of Labor and conducted by CONSAD Research Corporation. CONSAD is a Pittsburgh-based economic and policy research firm known for conducting studies for government agencies, including things like this analysis here and many others. For their literature review of the so-called gender wage gap, CONSAD drew on decades of mainstream labor economics research. Its purpose was simple: to evaluate what the evidence showed once headlines were set aside and structural employment factors were accounted for. As you can see here, the Department of Labor's conclusion was explicit, stating, and this is their direct quote, "Indeed, there may be nothing to correct. The differences in raw wages may be almost entirely the result of individual choices being made by both male and female workers." So the purpose of this video is to explain how they came to that conclusion, to show what was already known and how that information disappeared from public discussion. What follows is not my interpretation of data. It's simply the facts placed in front and center. So let's now discuss the larger context of the CONSAD report before diving into the findings from its review of nearly 50 studies, or approximately 50 studies. This was not a data collecting study or a wage gap witch hunt. It was a formal review of previous studies dating back to the 1960s that was requested by a federal agency to assess what wage gap research uncovered once methodological issues were applied systematically. CONSAD's analysis relied on mainstream labor economics methods and drew from peer-reviewed academic literature, data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and census-based studies. Its findings were grounded in conventional economic reasoning, not novel or experimental theory. There was no experiments done here. And just as important as the scope of this study is when the report was conducted and released. Published in January 2009, it predates the Obama era, having been conducted before he was elected to his first term. It predates the Trump era entirely. It predates the current culture war framing around gender, wages, and inequality. and it predates the social media movement that now drives much of the public conversation on these topics. And for me, that timing has important implications because the analysis did not emerge as a political reaction to later events or ideological conflicts. It reflects the state of the evidence as it was understood by the federal government before the modern political divide happened. All right, having said that, let's now dig into those 50 studies in the CONSAD report, which I'll do by outlining 7 major themes or factors across them. And so listen, if research and data are your thing, I highly recommend downloading a copy in its original source, in original form, using a link that I'll pin in a comment. I'll also be putting up some infographics and images directly from the report as I continue that aren't necessarily entirely necessary for viewing or listening, but added more as visual support for the discussion. The first theme regarding the research in the CONSAD Research Review is occupational selection and job sorting, which appears earlier in their literature than almost any other of the factors that we'll go through. As one example, a 1964 study reported that employers may offer lower wages to women if male consumers would prefer to deal with other males, and therefore be more beneficial to the business. So this might include jobs such as automobile sales, in which would affect the salesperson's commissions. And according to this study, up to 50% of any pay differences could be explained in this manner. Once occupation was controlled for statistically, wage differences between the genders narrowed substantially. Another study from 1991 that used establishment-level data showed that when men and women worked the same job, their pay was almost identical. That is, much of any observable wage gap disappeared when men and women were working in the same occupation at the same establishment. Later work in 2003 confirmed this finding with data sets that linked employers and employees, stating that disaggregating specific jobs reduced residual wage gaps by nearly 4%. So, in total, across studies that spanned nearly 40 years, from 1964 through the early 2000s, controlling for occupation alone typically explained 30 to 50% of the gender wage gap. And in some comparisons within narrowly defined job categories, any remaining gap was often small, inconsistent, or statistically indistinguishable from zero. Overall, regarding occupation selection, the consistent finding was not that women were paid less for the same job, but that men and women disproportionately worked in dissimilar jobs which paid differently. The second dominant factor regarding the Department of Labor's conclusion had to do with work experience and number of hours worked. Beginning in the 1970s, studies showed that wages were analyzed using measures of actual labor market experience rather than potential experience. Then much of the observed gender gap was reduced. This is because intermittent labor force engagement materially affects cumulative earnings. But when actual work histories were measured, wage gaps narrowed even more significantly than just accounting for occupational selection that we discussed just a moment ago. More specifically, researchers named Blau and Kahn summarized decades of findings that labor market attachment could reduce remaining estimated wage gaps by a meaningful margin, often on the order of tens of percent. And number of hours worked also affected outcomes independently of experience. Studies in the CONSAD report consistently stated that overtime and long weekends paid premium wages, particularly in professional and managerial positions. And men worked more overtime and longer hours on average, and earnings data tracked those differences very closely. In a less discussed aspect, I think this one is really interesting, some female hourly employees who worked overtime actually earned more than their male supervisors who were paid a base salary regardless of how many hours they worked. The third factor regarding wage gaps involved career interruptions and time spent out of the labor force. Beginning in the 1980s, studies began to increasingly examine wages as a consequence of interruptions due to caregiving, job changes, or other non-employment periods. Research by researchers, I think this was Light and Ureta in 1995, and later studies showed that wage penalties associated with interruptions in employment applied to both men and women, which could account for as much as 12% of the raw gender wage gap. However, women experienced more interruptions on average, which explained an additional proportion of the gap, even after controlling for occupational choices and experience. So hopefully you're noticing this common theme here. Each layer of these explanations is accounting for more and more of the so-called wage gap, and often at statistically significant levels after each layer that we add. And as evidence of the one thing that we hear all the time regarding employment interruptions, in 2007, researchers Day and Hill reported that motherhood is not associated with lower income, but that leave taken from a career is associated with lower income, and that such behavior is far more prevalent among mothers than among fathers. Now, let me reiterate that I know that you already are familiar with a lot of this. I'm not trying to insult your intelligence or to drag this on, but now you have the explicit study to support the statement when you're having these conversations with wage gap believers. Again, go ahead and download the full report from the pinned comment. This study is on page 71, and I'll put an image up here with the citation and study information. And in another layer of career disruptions, several analyses also showed that women disproportionately selected occupations that had lower interruption penalties. Along these lines, the fourth theme within the 50 articles that CONSAD had reviewed included motherhood specifically, along with other family-related choices. Contrary to simplified narratives, the literature did not identify a uniform motherhood wage penalty. In fact, in 2003, Anderson and colleagues reported that any motherhood wage penalty was approximately just 3 to 5% after accounting for personal employment characteristics. So it's safe to say that by this point, so much of the wage gap had already been explained by other factors that by the time we get to motherhood, there's almost nothing left to explain. And later studies summarized by CONSAD reinforced this conclusion. So by the early 2000s, that's more than 20 years ago, the literature had largely concluded that motherhood per se was not a reliable explanation of wage gaps once those other factors were accounted for. A fifth factor leading to the Department of Labor's conclusion was human capital differences, which explained wage variations. For example, studies showed that wages reflected the type, intensity, and continuity of skill investment rather than education levels alone. In fact, this is one of the areas in which any wage gap prior to the 1990s was found to start disappearing as women began to earn STEM degrees. And in 2000, researchers Blau and Kahn, I mentioned them earlier, reported that female workers in the 1990s earned wages that were nearly equal to the wages of their male counterparts. Furthermore, according to McCrate in 2005, differences such as on-the-job training and subsequent work autonomy contribute to wage differences. Again, even after occupational controls were applied. And from this group of studies, we learned that men, on average, invested more heavily in forms of human capital that led to higher pay variance and higher potential returns, and wages reflected those investments across periods. Industry-level effects were the sixth factor, which became more prominent in the 1990s, particularly with improved census and administrative data sets. This group of studies showed that wage differences reflected the concentration of men and women in different industries rather than unequal pay within the same industries. Specifically here, Boris and Rogers reported that female occupational preference is the largest contributing factor to any wage gap. And several studies even documented industries in which women earned wages that were equal to or higher than men once industry-specific factors were controlled. So these findings further weaken any claim of a nationwide wage penalty tied to gender alone. The seventh theme within the 50 studies that CONSAD reviewed involved pay differences relative to fringe benefits. People love to ignore this one. That is, total compensation rather than salary or hourly wages alone. Research summarized in the report showed that focusing exclusively on wages overstated economic differences. And in some occupations, women received relatively more generous benefits while men received higher cash wages outright. For example, in 2008, Lowen and Sicilian reported that descriptive statistics indicate women receiving more family-friendly fringe benefits than men. And well before that, in 1995, researchers reported that while the raw wage rate of females was 87% that of men, it increased to 96% that of men when including total compensation. Additionally, wives with health insurance from their own employer have been reported to accept wages that are about 20% lower than wages that they would have received from a job without health care insurance. So when these wage benefits are included, total compensation, any gaps there, narrow even more substantially and, in several cases, disappear entirely. Now, I obviously didn't cover everything in the 95-page report. But taken all together, the literature from 1964 through the mid-2000s tells a very consistent story. Controlling for those 7 factors I just went through, including occupation, experience, hours, interruptions, human capital, industry-specific jobs, compensation structure, and work arrangements, they all routinely explain the majority of the raw wage gap, which leads us to the question, with all of this evidence that we've known for well over 20 years, why is there still controversy surrounding the so-called wage gap? Why do people still believe it? One of the most important facts underlying this entire discussion, and which continues to fuel the wage gap myth, is that there is no official government-issued wage metric that fully adjusts for factors identified throughout the wage gap literature. That is, no federal agency publishes a single figure or formula that accounts simultaneously for occupation, experience, hours, interruptions, industry, and work arrangements, or everything combined. Now, this stands in contrast to how data in other sectors are classified and standardized. For example, education programs are formally categorized through national classification systems, and it's easy to track people's progress through higher education. And I think the second burning question is, why have you never heard of the CONSAD report or the 50 studies that's in it? The absence of the report from mainstream media coverage and public consumption was not the result of a single decision or coordinated suppression. In fact, many people argue that it was the predictable outcome of how information moves through institutions and media for the following reasons. First, the report was not a press-facing product. It was a commissioned research report delivered to the Department of Labor, published as a technical document without a press conference, an executive summary, or coordinated outreach to journalists. Second, the report presented a narrative dead end. Listen, the Department of Labor's conclusion was that there may be little or nothing to correct once the factors that we discussed were accounted for. And that finding did not lend itself to outrage, reform campaigns, legislative action, or any type of moral urgency. As you know, media incentives favor conflict over resolution. So a conclusion that closes the issue rather than escalates it offered little media payoff. The third reason you've never heard of it is that the findings contradicted an already forming symbolic narrative. By the mid-2000s, the raw wage gap narrative was increasingly used as shorthand for systemic inequality, and people did not want to let go of that narrative, regardless of the evidence. So the CONSAD conclusion undermined the simplicity that made the 76% of men's wages lie powerful and repeatable. Once a statistic like that is embedded in society, information that destabilizes it tends to be ignored rather than reported. The fourth reason you've never heard of it is the report required a fair amount of methodological literacy to understand. For the average person, it's not an easy read. Its conclusions depended on understanding things like distinctions between descriptive and causal statistics, proper measurement and statistical models, and how different model specifications affect results, especially across studies. And these are not concepts that translate easily into short-form reporting or headline-driven coverage. Hell, maybe that's why this video was so long and I didn't even cover everything in it. Fifth reason you've never heard of it is that no political coalition had an incentive to promote the findings. And here's, I think, one of the biggest reasons. Advocacy groups could not use the conclusions to advance any policy dynamics. Policymakers could not easily campaign on it, and employers had no reason to highlight it at all. Without institutions to champion the report, it remained politically neglected. Number 6, the timing of the report worked against it. Released in early 2009, it coincided with the financial crisis, the Obama administration transition, and widespread economic upheaval. At that time, media attention was consumed by unemployment, stimulus measures, and electing America's first black president. As such, a technical labor economics report was unlikely to break through in that environment at all. And finally, I think this is the saddest reason that you've never heard of the CONSAD report. Once the fake 76% wage gap narrative became entrenched, omission became safer than correction. Correcting the public record would have required institutions and media outlets to acknowledge years of oversimplification and lies. Taken together, these factors explain why an official, unretracted government conclusion never entered mainstream discourse. The report did not fail because it was weak or incorrect. It disappeared because it did not fit the incentives of the systems that are responsible for transmitting information to the public. For many men, the feminist wage gap narrative has always felt disconnected from real-life experience, myself included. We know that hours worked, job choice, risk tolerance, and career continuity all shape earnings in real life, yet we're told that outcomes can only be explained through discrimination. The evidence reviewed here validates from long-standing data what is missing from public conversations. The issue was never that men failed to understand the truth. It's that this key report, already documented by the federal government, was quietly excluded from how numbers are framed and repeated. Believing that sex-based wage discrimination exists requires acknowledging that nuance is conveniently ignored, labor structures are oversimplified, and a complex body of data-driven evidence over decades is completely wrong. Listen, thanks for making it all the way through this, guys, and I'll be back soon with more facts just like this. See you then.